Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode we are going to be fully rebuilding a set of Classic Mini radius arms. So stay tuned. As I said, on today's episode, we are going to be fully rebuilding a set of Classic Mini radius arms. Now, a radius arm on a Classic Mini is the pivoting point of your rear suspension. So your radius arms sit in the rear subframe, one of these on each side, and you have the post here where your wheel bearing sits and your actual wheel is attached. There's a hub that goes on that end. And then you have a knuckle joint down on the bottom. This is where the suspension is run up via a post up to the cone. And then as your wheels hit bumps, this radius arm is pivoting up and down and pressing the cone and creating that pressure to keep your car riding nice and smooth, but also to dampen that force and reduce the strain and the stress put on your suspension. Now, on the back side here, you have an additional post. This is for your actual shock absorber or your strut. And then right here is the pivoting point. This is often a point that needs to be greased. I've talked about this in previous episodes, but in our case, we're going to be taking the pivot joint, the actual the shaft out of this, and we're going to be replacing that. We're going to be replacing the bushings in there, and we're going to get this cleaned and powder coated, and it's going to look really nice. This is going to be a really good project, and I'm hoping that this helps a lot of you out so you can take your radius arms off, feel confident enough to address this and fix it yourself. These are usually serviceable parts, and it's relatively easy to work on these and to replace and to fix the things that are on your radius arms. Sometimes they reach a point where they're just too far gone, and that happens, obviously. But if you can, it's generally better to rebuild and fix these things so you can kind of keep this stuff original and keep it on the road, which is the main goal of this channel, as you guys know. Now, in addition to replacing some of these joints and everything, we are going to be using a pretty cool reaming tool. Now, this is used to resize and fit this bushing right here into the pivot point on the radius arms. And don't worry, I'm going to go over all of this in this video. The first thing we need to do, though, is get these on the bench and on the bench vise and start taking them apart and getting all the old gunky stuff off, so that they can be sent over the powder coaters and then obviously cleaned up and made really nice. So one thing I do want to mention before we do get started is that all of the parts you see on the table here are available at 7 Mini Parts. They are my long-term parts sponsor, and if you guys want to support the channel, you can head over to their website, use the links in my description, and pick up any of the parts that you see in this video right there on their website, and then of course rebuild your own radius arms. So anyways, let's get over to the bench and start taking these apart. Okay, so first up, what we're going to be doing is removing the existing pivot shaft. This is a shaft that runs through the radius arm. We're going to remove this, and this should slide out relatively easy, assuming that it was at least adequately greased. It's kind of funny that this washer is just stuck on there, but that'll slide out, and you'll be left with something like this, probably really greasy, really gross. These don't need to be reused, so these can be discarded. Next, there is going to be a rubber seal right on here. That should pop right off without much fuss. Pretty easy. Now we're going to be moving to what could be relatively easy or what also could be really difficult. So right here you have a roller bearing. Now inside this pivot shaft here, you have a plastic sheath. This is a new shaft that we're going to be putting in later, but this plastic sheath right here is what helps isolate this pivot shaft from the internal workings of, of this radius arm. The radius arm itself is actually pretty hollow. That helps reduce the weight of these pretty substantially because these are already pretty heavy. But there is a plastic sheath inside this pivot shaft here. So to get this roller bearing out, you are going to need something called a blind bearing puller. Now the way that these work is you have this little tool here, and this one is fully expanded already, but you unscrew this, it goes down in here, it then expands and then will prevent it from coming out. And then you use a normal bearing pulling device like this one here to actually screw down and pull that bearing out. This has been one of the best tools that I've purchased, and I cannot recommend it enough. And if you want to pick one of these up for this project or for any other project, I posted a link to this in my description. It's just an Amazon link. But first things first, let's go ahead and unscrew this one here so you guys can see how this works. As I'm unscrewing this, you can see that is actually reducing in size, so now it can go down in here. Because that plastic sheath is in there, you want to basically expand this as much as you can so that it catches the bottom of this roller race. And if you're lucky, the roller race will come out without too much fuss. If you're unlucky, the roller race is going to disintegrate and you're going to have a lot harder time, and in some situations you might even have to cut this out. Obviously that is not ideal, so let's pray that this goes in here and doesn't have any problems. So that is nice and tight. I wanted that to be as wide as it possibly can be. Next up, we're going to put the bearing pulling tool on here. That screws right on. And now with those clamping faces in place, fingers crossed that this bearing comes out. Once this bearing comes out, getting the other one out is pretty easy, usually. So let's see how we do. Yeah, so it looks like, well, we might be moving, or we could be pulling all of the roller races out. Hopefully, it's still pretty tight, so I'm thinking I might actually have the whole race here. Let's see. I don't think so, though. Yeah. So unfortunately, this one did what the other one did as well, which is pull out the whole inner race instead of the actual roller race itself. So what I did to get around this is, one, we need to pick up all of these little rollers here. I have a slightly larger bearing puller, and you can see this one has the old race on it actually still. So I did this on the other radius arm first. So we're going to run this back down in here and really tighten this up so that it'll press into that plastic casing a little bit, but we want it to reach out underneath the this race here so that we can yank it out, pull it out effectively. All right, we've got that set up again. Now let's see if we can get this race out. Whoop, got a little movement. There we go. So that race, yeah, there we go. So you will have a lot of tension on this. This is not going to be easy in general. The pulling tool should help, but in some situations this does need to be cut out. Thankfully, this is not one of those situations. So almost out. There we go. We've got the race out, and now the plastic piece should slide out pretty easily. If it doesn't slide out easily, you can use like a little pick here and hook on to the plastic. There we go. And this one you can see is really worn. It's definitely way past its life. So this is ready to get replaced. This also gets discarded. Now the last thing that we need to do is get the bronze bushing out of the other side. So I took the washers off on that side, and now this is where we have a pretty cool little tool. So this is essentially just a drive. So you have a kind of a tapered end here. Now this slides right down in here, and it fits inside the bushing down on the other side. So let me move you guys down there so you can see how this comes out. Now you can see the driver that we have here has slotted down into the bronze bushing that's right down there. And all we have to do is hammer this, and it should drive that bronze bushing out pretty easily. So let's go ahead and do that. Yep, nice. Now you can see this is our bronze bushing, and this is what we're going to have to ream when we replace this with a new bronze bushing, and then our tapered punch right here can be set aside. Now there's only one more thing that we need to remove here, and that is this plastic knuckle cup here. So this is one of the old ones from the other radius arm, and that gets replaced with one of these beautiful new ones, just like this. That'll be a little bit later in the episode. The easiest way I found to remove these, if they cooperate, if they aren't completely seized in there, is to use a pry bar and just kind of wiggle it out. And sometimes it can be a little bit easier if you give it a little tap, a little hammer, to loosen it up. And there we go. Knuckle cup is out. Pretty easy part of this job, usually. If they don't want to come out, if they're completely seized in there, you can also use like some heat to kind of basically just cook it and melt it out of there. Works pretty well. Now the last thing I want to talk about before we get this off to the powder coater is the stub axle. Now these stub axles usually have to be pressed in with an actual machine press. Sometimes they are loose enough to get out, but most of the time you need a machine press to do it. Now, to determine whether or not you need to replace your stub axle here, is feeling this face right here, which is where your rear bearing sits, and then the hub sits around this. To determine that, run your finger up and down this face right here, and if you feel any sort of ridges, any sort of grooves, anything like that, then it probably needs to be replaced. If you don't feel any ridges, then you should be okay. You can see here there's a light visual difference between this portion and this portion here, but there's no tangible line right there. So I think we're in good shape. Don't think this needs to be replaced in this situation. And in a lot of setups, these stub axles actually have the threads reversed on one side, which is a little counterintuitive for those of you who are used to righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. This one right here is the right side, so when you tighten it down, you're tightening it by spinning it right. But this one right here is tightened by spinning it left, which is a little weird. But feeling this one as well, it's in great shape and doesn't need to be replaced. So all we need to do now is get this off to the powder coaters, and then once we get those back, we'll have a nice look at them because they're going to be really, really clean and pretty. And then we can start reassembling them with the new parts. All right, so we have these beautiful radius arms back from the powder coater, and they are looking incredible. The color that Davey chose for these is just absolutely, it's beautiful. I love the textured look, and I think it's gonna look really cool underneath this car. Now, installing your bushings is relatively easy. The process involves, basically, you can do this a few different ways. The way I like to do it is using a piece of threaded rod like this. I actually learned this trick from Keith Miller over on Classic Mini Workshop. Basically what I did is I took a piece of threaded rod I picked up at the hardware store and then welded on a nut and some washers on one side. This is going to hold it in place so these aren't rattling around on one side. And then basically what you're going to do is run this up through the radius arm, and it sandwiches and pulls the bearing into place, or the bushing in this case into place. Now with this job, order of operations is everything. You have this plastic tube that comes with it. You have a bronze bushing, looks just like that. That's what's going in on this side here. Then we have a roller bearing. The roller bearing goes into the side that has the knuckle joint connection point. That goes on that side. But what you have to do is install the bronze bushing first, then your cup. This cup is actually tapered. You might be able to see that there in the video. It's really, really subtle. But the larger side goes towards the knuckle, and the smaller side goes up towards the bronze bushing. And then, of course, after we've got all these pieces installed, we got to come back through and ream this, which I'll show you guys how to do here in just a minute. But starting off, let's get our bronze bushing installed. Now, I have found that installing this bronze bushing can be a little bit finicky, can give you a little bit of a headache. And before we put this on here, I do want to show you guys, these bronze bushings are not reamed to the cylinder here from the factory. This is probably one of the only weird jobs that's on the Mini that requires you to do some extra work in order to make it work. But basically, we have to ream this hole, this bronze bushing, to accept and fit around this cylinder here when it's in place. Now what we'll do is we'll take our bronze bushing here, and what I'm going to do is add a little bit of oil on the outside of it, not a ton. I just want to help guide this into place because sometimes this can be a little bit stubborn. It's just a little bit, not a lot. If you put too much in here, it's going to make it actually much harder. It's going to make it harder, and it won't make it stay in place as well. Now, what I do to start this off is get my rubber mallet, and then we're going to run our threaded rod up from the bottom, and the angle's just a little awkward there. And our threaded rod comes out the top here. Now that electric socket wrench, while much easier, is not going to actually work for the majority of this, so we are going to need to actually use a manual cranker here. And we're going to slide this down into place. So that is perfectly flush now, which is exactly what we're aiming for. So the next thing that we need to do is put our plastic cup in the other side. So let's flip this over, and then we'll put our roller race in the opposite side here. Now our plastic cup, as I mentioned before, is tapered. The larger side is going to go up on top here, and this should go in pretty easily. If it doesn't, you can take the driver here and just kind of press it in with your hand, or a set of needle nose pliers should do it pretty easily. You shouldn't have to force this in here. It should slide in relatively easily. The next step is to install the roller bearing here. Now this one should go in a little bit easier than that bronze bushing. I've found for whatever reason, they seem to be easier. And we're going to take our threaded rod, although we are pretty stripped on this rod. Hopefully we can still get this to work. And there we have it, roller bearing installed. Pretty straightforward, as I said. Really, it's just about clamping these down and pushing them into place just in the right order. Now, this next part is the hardest part of the whole job, in my opinion. So let's flip this back over to the bronze side. All right, so this next part of the job is probably the most tedious part, but it is also really the most important part. Basically what we're doing is we're taking this bladed device here. Now, when I say bladed, you can actually see on here, these each individually are a blade, and when you tighten or loosen these two ends right here, it's actually moving these blades one direction or the other. And there's an actual cut inside this threaded rod here, and it's tapered. So when you tighten it, it's going to make these wider, and when you loosen it, it's going to make them come in and not ream as much. So the way that you want to do this is really slow and really steady. So we can see here, this reaming device right now fits down inside this this bronze bushing without any issue whatsoever right now. And it kind of tightens up right at the end, which makes sense because this is the smaller side and it gets larger up at the top ever so slightly. This job is where you're going to have to take your actual cylindrical rod here that comes with the kit, test it. Obviously doesn't fit straight out of the box. This is why we have this reaming tool. And then we come back, ream a little bit more, back and forth, back and forth. Now, You might ask, how do I ream this perfectly straight up and down? And I'm going to show you. So down at the bottom here, you've got a little unit here. This comes with this kit. And basically, this is what holds and centralizes a rod that gets connected to your reaming tool. So you've got your rod here. This screws into the actual reaming tool, just like this. So now you have a drive to run down through your radius arm. I can find the hole. That's what she said. Comes out the bottom just like that. And now we can effectively ream this while this tool down here keeps it centralized. It's a pretty ingenious little tool that they've got set up here. The only part that we're missing is right here up at the top. Normally you have a set of bars that connect to the top here. Unfortunately, the kit didn't have this with it when I got it, so this was second hand in this situation. So what we're gonna have to do is just use a standard adjustable wrench, no big deal at all. And then we start reaming. All right, and so with that, we have a successfully reamed bushing on this side here. Now, this is something you're definitely going to want to take your time on because it is relatively easy to over-ream this, which means that you've just taken out too much material, and then your pivot shaft here is just going to be bouncing around in here. One thing that I do want to mention about this process, now you might have seen that I was adding oil in that time lapse there. Basically what I'm doing is I'm lubricating this so that it is cutting into that bronze bushing evenly and nicely. But that oil actually has a secondary task of catching the bronze shavings you can see on the reamer here. We want to try and catch as much of those bronze shavings because if we don't, what's going to happen is that those bronze shavings fall through this tube here, through the plastic tube and down into the roller bearing. It's probably the least ingenious part of this tool. I guess theoretically you could come up from the bottom, so flip this upside down, come up from the bottom, but I find it's much easier to get a straight, nice, good ream on this from the top side. Now, our pivot shaft here, I'm going to slide this in here, I'm going to show you guys what it looks like, but basically this slides into place through the other roller bearing, and that's nice and tight in there. There is just a teeny tiny amount of play in here, but what you will notice is that once this is greased up, that'll tighten up and that won't be existent at all. So with that out of the way, I am going to go ahead and put our rubber gaiter on this side here. This is the outer side. We just want to kind of complete this top portion of the job. And so that is in place. And we are going to put our washer. Boom. Our lock washer, that goes on next. And then the other bolt, actually I mean nut. And then we're going to slide the rubber gaiter around the back side here to seal this up nice and tight for its transit. I always found these rubber gaiters to be kind of awkward in the way that they go on there. They never seem to fit right, and they never really seem to look like they fit right on there, but whatever. The last thing that we're going to cover here is how to install a handbrake quadrant. This can be kind of confusing for folks who haven't done this before or for folks who have, like me. Basically, my Mark I style radius arm actually has a threaded stud in right here, and you actually tighten on your handbrake quadrant with a nylon locking nut, as opposed to later style arms like this where you have a post. Now it's important, we're looking at the bottom of the radius arm here, and it's important to remember that the post needs to go in from the bottom. That's going to allow you to service this from the bottom of the radius arm, basically with the arm still in place. It goes in just like this. Washer sits on the outside of your handbrake quadrant here, and you'll notice the rounded end of this handbrake quadrant extends to where the hub and the hub assembly goes, and then the more angled side is what's going to go in towards your car. Now we'll flip this over and then we'll install our split pin on the other side. Now you might have noticed I am using a clamp here to tighten this down, and that is because the spring washer that holds this quadrant on, plus the quadrant, plus the powder coating has made this a little bit tight, but it shouldn't cause any sort of binding issues, but it does cause issues when you want to get this darn split pin in. And there we have it, a handbrake quadrant successfully installed and turning nicely. So now that we have that done, we're finished up with our radius arm. All right, so that is going to wrap up this episode of Classic Mini DIY. This was a pretty cool episode. It's one I've been wanting to do quite a while, and I want to say a huge thank you to Davey for sending me out these radius arms so that I could show you guys how to do this on the channel. If you guys have a project on your car that maybe you haven't seen on the channel yet, and if you're close by, or if it's something that you can mail to me, I will do the job for you in exchange, obviously, for the time and the parts so that I can show you guys how to do this on, Classic Mini DIY. If that's something that you're interested in, shoot me a message, classicminidiy@gmail.com. I'll do the job and I'll show you guys how to do it on the channel and then send them back to you. It's not something that has a super fast turnaround, as you can imagine. Filming things does take a little while, but you do get free labor out of it. Now, if you guys have any questions about the process that I covered on this episode, or you're looking for something a little bit more in depth where you're building up the rest of the radius arm, your back plate and your hub and everything like that, let me know in the comments below, or you can check out some of my buddies' channels. Classic Mini Workshop, Keith Miller, does a great how-to on how to assemble the hub. So does William Murfitt. All the links to their channels are in the description below, and maybe in the future I'll cover that on this channel as well. And of course, any of the parts that you see on this episode can be picked up at 7 Mini Parts, my long-term part sponsor, except for these very specific Mini Sport brake quadrants. Though 7 Mini Parts has quite a wide array of brake quadrants and various other parts that you might need for your radius arms on your Classic Mini. So until I see you guys on the next one, you know the drill. Enjoy those minis and motor on.